So let's get started, and we begin with healthcare, where we will, amongst other concerns, highlight diversity and liability issues. And ladies and gentlemen, I think you hardly need me to remind you that the pandemic fast-forwarded digitalization in healthcare, just as it did in so many other sectors, whether through remote participation in pharmaceutical clinical trials, whether in telemedicine or in development of precision drugs and screening. AI promises to deliver major advances in both diagnosis and treatment. So here to tell us more about the potential gains and risks are leading researchers, academics, policymakers, and regulators working in the health field. I'll introduce all of them, and then we'll get started with a look at our use case. So starting over here to your right, ladies and gentlemen, Alexander Leichtle is Associate Professor at the University Institute of Clinical Chemistry at Bern University Hospital. Welcome, great to have you with us. Then joining us online, and I think probably we won't see him till a little bit later, but I'm told is already with us, Jiangbo Pu, Associate Professor, Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences and Peking Union Medical College. Hello.
Hello.
Great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. I'm also very pleased to introduce Andreas Reis. He is co-lead Health Ethics and Governance Unit at the Research for Health Department of the World Health Organization, the WHO. Great that you can be with us. Seated in the middle is Kerstin Noëlle Vokinger. She is Professor for Public Law and Digitalization in the Health Law and Regulatory Sciences faculty at the University of Zurich. Welcome. And I'm very pleased to welcome Kai Stölting. He is a scientist with the Swiss Federal Institute of Metrology, METAS. So a very warm welcome to all of you. And I will ask Kerstin to get us started, please, with a look at the use case in the healthcare sector.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. It's my honor to be here and speak to you today. And before we will start with our panel discussion, I would like to give you an introduction into the topic of AI in healthcare and the use cases that we would like to discuss in this regard. So if we could please go on with the next slide.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So next doesn't work.
Dear technical team, can you help us out with the slides?
If we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So let me just start with, well, we know all the slides, so let me just go ahead. So AI has already entered the arena of medicine, and we can see that in different areas in medicine. One area is, for example, research and clinical trials. So as you probably all know, medicines and medical drugs, in order for them to be marketed, in order for them to be approved and administered by physicians to patients, they need to go to rigorous clinical trials. And in order to conduct these clinical trials, we need to recruit patients, participants. This is a crucial step, and it needs a lot of resources, both on a financial level and with regard also to women manpower that has to be here invested, because we don't only recruit ideally patients from one country, but rather from multiple countries across the globe. Now, AI can help to actually identify the right patients, the right participants, by looking through all the relevant medical documents. Thank you very much. All the relevant medical documents and all information also, for example, provided through the devices that we have. And so this helps to be more efficient and to save resources. Another example, and that brings me Could you please forward to the next slide? That brings me to our use cases. Those are the applications of AI in medicine with regard to diagnostics and therapy. So prominent examples in medicine are the application of AI in dermatology or in radiology. Now, in dermatology, we would see here now the hand of a white and a darker patient and here you can see this right now. You can see here the image of a white patient, and you can see the darker spot that is highly suspicious for melanoma. And you can see also the hand of a darker patient also with a lesion highly suspicious for melanoma. Now, melanoma is a black cancer, black skin cancer, and it is a lethal cancer if not diagnosed accurately, timely, and therapy timely. So it's very crucial to diagnose this disease. AI can help by learning through these images to detect these lesions. Another example is what you can see on the slide here, AI in radiology. So here you can see the image of a female breast, a so-called mammography, and you can see how the AI system on this picture here highlights and depicts a lesion that is highly suspicious for breast cancer. As you probably know, every 7th woman suffers from breast cancer, so it's also a very tragic disease, and diagnosis is relevant and accurate therapy. So AI can help to detect these lesions and thus support the physician by guiding him which lesions the physician, the radiologist, should specifically look at. So if you could please go on to the next slide. What we can see in medicine is that AI allows a lot of opportunities. So there are chances for medicine efficiency that can be driven and opportunities for patients and physicians to improve access, but also medicine per se, diagnosis and treatment. However, we have also multiple challenges, and we highlighted 3 on this slide here. So one challenge that we would then also like to further discuss in the panel discussion is the challenge of bias. You probably still remember the image with melanoma of the white and of the darker patient. Now, if the AI system is trained only with images from white patients, it will most likely fail to diagnose melanoma of darker patients because it hasn't been trained on that images. So that leads to a bias, and it marginalizes certain patients group that often already per se are marginalized. So that's a big issue that we face with regard to AI, and it's important to mitigate this risk. One way of how we can mitigate this, and again, we'll talk more about this afterwards in the panel, is to allow and introduce diversity in the training of such systems. Another challenge is black box. So as you could see on the former slide, you could see how the AI system tries to detect certain lesions, be that, for example, in the breast, it can also be in the lungs, it can also be on the skin. But to me, just looking at the image, it is unclear how the AI system reached to that conclusion and why it highlighted exactly that lesion. And medicine is not black and white, so it's not either cancer or non-cancer, but we do have also lesions that can be in between or that have to be looked at more specifically. And so it's really crucial to also understand how did the AI system reach to that conclusion. And that's relevant for physicians, it's relevant for patients, it can be relevant for policymakers. So for all stakeholders involved, it can be important to understand why the AI system reached to a certain conclusion, and that specifically also allows to enable trust. So if we understand how a system reached to a result, that can enable trust, or at least one aspect of enabling trust. And this is again something that we will talk about later on. The last risk that we highlighted, and obviously there are more, but we like to focus on these 3, that's the challenge of liability. So the more sophisticated these AI systems will get in the future, the more also the question arises, how much responsibility should such a system take? And how should responsibility be distributed between manufacturer, maybe even between the system itself, or between those who apply the system. In the case of these use cases here, that would be the physicians. So we have multiple stakeholders and many more now, with AI entering the arena of medicine, that are also involved in the diagnostic and therapy of patients and diseases. If you could please go on to the next slide. So on the next slide, you will see a network of the different stakeholders involved and also of the different levels of how we can regulate these risks and how we can mitigate risks. So in the center, we always have the patient. The patient is the crucial person, and we should make sure that AI is developed in a way that the patient can profit optimally and maximally from AI. Around the patient, we have academia, we have industry. Thank you. Yes, this is the right slide. So academia and industry, they develop AI, they implement and apply also AI. So they're also crucial stakeholders. And as you can see here around the patient, if you could please go back again, around the patient and academia and research, we have here we have international regulations, we have national regulations, thank you. We have standards and we have conformity assessments. And the question that is really in the core also of today's panel discussion is, who and where should these risks be mitigated and regulated? What should be regulated on an international level? What should be regulated on a national level? What outside of the regulations, be that standardizations, be that conformity assessment? And that is really crucial because some can be more dynamic, for example, standards, while, as you for sure know, regulations are much trickier and it can take longer to actually, again, adapt to new technologies or to new advancements and new risks and mitigation of risks. So I hope I could spark your interest into this topic, and we will now proceed with our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Vokinger. And I'm very sorry, ladies and gentlemen, for the technical issues that we've had with the presentation. Hopefully we'll be able to smooth that out next time around. Let me ask everybody to talk a little bit about what you see as the main risks. We did, of course, mention bias, we mentioned liability and black box issues, but perhaps there are others that concern you as well, maybe even that you've encountered in your own work. So I'm just going to go across the panel and ask you to put that out there, and then we'll start talking a little bit about how we work to address those risks. And I'll start over there, if I may, with Alexander.
Yes, thank you. I think we heard it yesterday already. The biggest issue is the data on which we build our models. And if the data is biased, also the models will be biased. And if you see how fancy, for example, AI and working with AI is perceived, and how difficult it is to implement data quality standards, even in the hospitals, because the data is recorded not only for research, it's mainly the main purpose is treating the patient and reimbursement. That's the main drivers for capturing the data. Then it's frequently not suitable for AI applications, and that's a huge problem. And for example, if students apply at my group, I tell them 80% of the work is data tidying, and maybe 20% is working with AI and building models and the interesting stuff. And as long as we do not ensure the data quality, we are somehow building our AI building on sand and cannot be sure that the results are replicable and useful in the end.
Meaning, for example, if the data is being generated within the healthcare system, patients who don't have full access to that system would be underrepresented in the data sets.
For example, or what we also frequently see is that data is simply missing because it's not, people do not think of a further research use, so it's not recorded, and then we have big gaps in the data that is then hindering the use for AI.
Thank you very much. And I'll ask Jiangbo to also weigh in on this, if you would. Jiangbo, what do you see as the crucial risks in this area?
Thank you very much. And I think trust is the cornerstone of the successful healthcare systems, and artificial intelligence and the AI both promise great benefits and poses new risks for medicine, and failures in medical AI could erode public trust in healthcare. And besides the bias, I think AI also could be attacked by deliberate inputs and harm the AI models behind the scene. And AI also magnifies existing cybersecurity risks, potentially threatening patients' privacy and confidence and other important information of the patient. Yeah, and I think successful design and implementation of AI will therefore require strong governance and administrative mechanisms, and also the governance of new AI systems could span the period from design and implementation through and for repurposing and retirement. Yeah, and this is my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So security and privacy risks, and of course, all of us, I think, are aware of the discussion around dual use also in this area, the potential that data generated for healthcare purposes could, for example, be used by insurers to exclude some people from getting insurance. Let me go on now to Andreas, if I may.
Thank you. So WHO recognizes the potential, the enormous potential of AI for health and for healthcare, for health research, AI-based drug development, for example, or we've seen in our use case, the use for diagnostics or radiology. At the same time, we strongly believe that ethics and human rights must be at the center of AI, of the development and use of AI, if all populations are to benefit equally from this new technology. You know, inequities and inequalities are really at the heart of WHO's mission. And this is why that's really a main concern in the area of new technologies as well. And last year, we published a WHO guidance document on ethics and governance of AI, which enumerates the different risks that we've already mentioned, but also makes a number of recommendations to all kind of stakeholders involved. And one that hasn't been mentioned as much yet is the area of unequal access. And I think that's really one of the main concerns, that this goes both within countries and also between countries. So in countries, we have certain strata of the population, for example, the older people who might not have the digital literacy, who might, fall behind using these new tools. But of course, also globally speaking, we have huge differentials in access to internet and access to digital tools. And there is a risk that AI might further exacerbate these inequities if we don't take care in the development and in the deployment of AI.
And I was told, in fact, that during the pandemic, in some of the remote trials that were conducted, that was absolutely an issue, that those who were not as digitally savvy tended to not be able to participate in trials that were conducted remotely. Can you just say one word, if you would, about AI in the WHO's work during the pandemic to try to collect data? Did you apply it there? And can you say a word about that?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is a lot of growth of AI-based technologies during the pandemic globally. there was a lot of use in the area of digital tracking. There was a big discussion, and we also issued a guidance document on that. But what we're seeing, and this will be really the future, is AI-based surveillance. And WHO has just established last year a specific hub in Berlin, which will be dedicated to pandemic surveillance, and AI-based tools will be an essential part of that.
Thank you very much. And I invite more questions on that later on if people are interested. But let me now finally go to Kai Stölting to talk a little bit about where you see particular risks and concerns from your point of view as a standards and conformity assessor.
Well, there are many issues that come to mind. One would be that you might want to have an AI out there that's actually working once it's released on the market, which is by itself not necessarily guaranteed alone. And from a standards point of view, I think it obviously makes sense to validate that the algorithms are working, that the input data sets are in such a way that they actually can predict something for the population that they're being used on. Beyond that, I would see also the data that goes into certain sets of analysis. That data itself might not only be saying something about the patient you derived it from, but also to closely related individuals. So I would want to make sure that, I would want to see also as a patient, as a user myself, I would want to make sure that this data actually stays where it's supposed to be. You've mentioned the insurers that have been that might get access to it and then might use it to predict the future of my children, other closely related individuals. That's something I would want to see. The discussions yesterday left it a little bit open. Everybody seemed to strive for getting more trust into AI, but the definition of what that trust actually entitles, what it really means, what people are trusting on, so the ethical component of it, or the moral component of it, I think that's a very, very pertinent issue, and I'm not sure consensus on that has been reached already. Otherwise, it would be easy to set up a few guidelines to actually achieve that.
And indeed, I think how we operationalize this is a crucial aim of this conference, but it was clear yesterday from our discussions that that is a very complex and ongoing challenge. But let's talk exactly about that. And by the way, what you just said reminded me of the fact that we're seeing in the US increasing use of DNA tests that were generated for genealogy sites actually being applied in law enforcement to identify related individuals. So again, a clear boundary issue. Let us now indeed begin our discussion of solutions and collaboration. And I'll start, if I may, with Kerstin. You identified some of the key risks from your point of view. Who needs to do what to address these? Picking up on what we just heard here about from a standards point of view, how do we get at the problem of unconscious bias? How do we operationalize that, for example?
Yeah, so I think in a more, just zooming out and in a more general way, we should really try to think about on which level, first of all, we should regulate certain risks. So as we all know, AI doesn't stop at the country's border, but actually goes over the border, and it's important that we also not just think about our own nation, but actually try to understand what are the general principles where we can cooperate across nations. So what we, for example, saw in a study is that more countries are now introducing new regulations in multiple countries, and there are common things that are being regulated. For example, bias that countries would like to mitigate. And that's the goal of every country. So we should think about what can be done on an international level and what should be done on a national level. And I believe that the core principles should be regulated by either international or national regulations, and the more technical issues, so going into detail, that, for example, how specifically to actually mitigate risk, that should be done, for example, through standardization or through conformity assessment. So the more technical it gets, the more granular also we can regulate that, but the core principles that apply across nations, that is something that can be regulated on higher levels.
Thank you very much. And let me perhaps go to the healthcare specialists on the panel to talk about what kind of a rule or standard would allay some of your concerns, for example, about unconscious bias and or incomplete data sets. Alexander?
Well, I think AI cannot solve all the problems that are around. And for example, if you look at patients with rare diseases, we already have the problem that there is not too much data around, and the predictions you can make with these data have quite large confidence intervals. So that's a general problem. And AI is just a tool, as many other diagnostic tools, and it cannot really solve it. What we learned from, for example, diagnostics or other medical fields is that you need some kind of good practice, good clinical practice, good laboratory practice to perform your testing, your assessment correctly. And then I think you still have to know that there are limitations that you can't overcome, even applying the most elaborated AI solutions that you have. So I think there should be also some kind of label that warns the applying person that there are limitations because of, for example, the low number of patients involved for a specific phenotype.
Thank you very much. If you are applying AI, do you let your patients know that in some form AI is involved in a diagnosis or in a treatment process? And if so, what's the response that you get from them?
Well, currently we are using AI in terms of research projects with ethical approval and patient consent. So the patients are then aware that we are doing something like that. But the implementation and the transition from the bench to the bedside is a huge step that is maybe even too huge for just researchers to go. So all the regulatory burdens that come with making an algorithm a medical product for clinical use are like a deterrent for researchers to go this step.
And Andreas, essentially same question to you, staying first of all with the question of the reliability of data sets. I want to come back to liability a little later so we don't have too many baskets open at one time. But what do you think would be a workable way to address this risk of incomplete or unreliable or biased data? And what are you currently doing to counteract that?
Yeah, I think bias is really one of the biggest risks, and we've seen it on that one slide in the detection of skin cancer and melanoma. But we're also very concerned about missing data sets from LMICs, for example, low and middle income countries, but also from older people. And I think the key here is inclusivity. We, in doing research projects, in gathering the data, which are then aggregated and become big data, it's very important to have from the start a inclusive design, and it's also important to include in the team of designers, in the team of programmers, also a fair representation from these populations that are concerned. So it's very important to, from the start, include ethical and equity concerns in the programming and in the data collection, so that in the end, the outcome is also inclusive.
Jiangbo, can you talk a little bit? You mentioned the risks of the security of data and the privacy of data. Could you talk about what you actually are doing within your particular health organization or within the society as a whole to mitigate those risks and to address some of the issues that we're talking about?
Thank you for Melinda. And we are basically a colleague of research on the medical area. And I think the patients are at the center of the medical AI. And besides the security issues and I think the data leaking issues, I think the human dimension of healthcare involves the unique professional and patient relation in this related values and duties. And besides those risks, many AI models are black boxes that cannot be explained their recommendations. And I think this lack of transparency could damage trust and the recommendations and damage the trust by requiring patients to make choices without understanding the relevant information. And also, I think the use of black boxes could also makes it difficult to identify bias within models that could lead to worse outcomes. And I think one problem for any powerful AI is that the practitioners may come to rely on it and even to rely on its bad results. So I think the concern has also been raised about the incremental replacement of human beings with AI systems, and the security issues could, on the other way, to harm the overall trust of our application of medical AI. Yeah, thank you.
May I just ask you, Jiangbo, because you talked about data leakage, what kind of standards or rules are in place to ensure that data that is generated for healthcare purposes in your community, in your medical college and in the medical system remains in that system and doesn't leak into other areas, like, for example, use by employers or use by government officials?
Thank you for the question. Like Alexander says, we are doing some research approved by the Ethical Review Board, and therefore we can assure our data is being protected in a safe box or a safe in the college or in the university. But I think in the commercial products used in the hospitals and developed by some companies, I think this might be a point that standardization and regulation comes in to solve this issue. Like the insurance company could not use this data to give us some discount on our insurance fees. So I think this is very important to make sure that the data is used properly.
Thank you. And Kerstin, we often hear, it was just mentioned by Andreas, this idea about trying to get ethics by design, trying to build ethics into the algorithms. How feasible is that? What does that actually look like in practice?
So what it means is, first of all, that we agree on certain ethical principles. That's step number one. And if we agreed on this ethical principle, it actually means that everyone involved in the AI system, so be that the developer, be that those people who apply it, be that those who approve it, all actually then really respect those principles. And we have to make sure that these are really general principles so that they can be really also followed and respected by everyone. And that's one crucial point, that we can see that all these ethical principles that have been developed so far, be that by international organizations, be that by private stakeholders, or be that also by countries that issued such principles, that we have common principles. For example, one can be avoidance of bias, so diversity. Another one is, for example, privacy. And so to make sure that really everyone involved in this can respect and will respect this.
It sounds very logical, but if I think back to my legal education, one of the first things we discussed in criminal law was a case where a person is stuck in the entrance of a cave, and there are 25 other people behind that person in the cave. Utilitarianism would say, of course, we need to get rid of him in order to help those people. But others would say we cannot take a human life, no matter what. How do you resolve that? Those are both ethical principles that you could support. So who decides?
That's a very good point. But I guess one other good point that you make is that you're describing a problem that we had already prior to AI, right? So what we can see is that with AI, we do not have really new problems evolving, but we have ethical issues that we already had before. Inequity in healthcare, that's not new with AI. We already had inequity before, okay? So we are dealing with issues and problems that repeats itself in history. So we have obviously to think about who should make that decision, and I believe that that should be as a society as a whole, and then it will be international organizations who then try to issue such ethical principles. But I think one really crucial point is that we can try to learn from history and try to learn from our failures, from the challenges that we had, also from the opportunities that we had, and to learn from there. So I truly believe that international organizations such as the WHO have a very crucial role in mitigating these risks and in developing ethical principles. And the role of policymakers and regulators then is to actually enact those relevant ethical principles into law, be that on international level, where we have to find a consent among multiple countries, or also then on national level.
Kai, if we were trying to operationalize something like a principle of non-bias and inclusion in data sets generated for medical purposes, how would we do that and assess that in practice?
Nice question. Thank you. Well, in a way, it's, if you want to look at it from an operational point of view, maybe what you can do is you can open up the algorithm, see how he behaves, given the data sets that are underlying it. And you can evaluate, I think, to a certain degree, technically, to how far the light shines. And that's the work, I think, that goes for a Metrology Institute, to really say how much can you measure, how much can you say given a data set. Now, the biases in the data set that go into it in the first place are hard to evaluate unless you have a very good knowledge about how the system looks at in the beginning. And these are then ethical issues or political issues that need to be addressed beforehand. So I don't think a simple yardstick is enough to say that an algorithm is behaving properly or is not behaving properly. But I think what might be a way to approach this is, now let's take a few of these algorithms, let's open them up, let's see how they're behaving, let's see how far the light actually shines, and then take it from there, see if we can generalize from there. Take a relatively well understood case like the melanoma predictions or the mammography scans that we've seen there, see how far the light shines, how far we can really predict, and take it from there. Now, that doesn't solve all the ethical problems that have been raised, and I'm not convinced yet, and also considering the discussions on the last day, that people will reach one unifying global ethic that applies to everybody. I think we are all very diverse, and I'm very thankful for that. So a good standard or a good standardization should take into account certain basic principles that everybody can apply to, but then leave enough leeway, leave enough possibility to develop the nation-specific or population strata-specific ethics that are needed then on top of that.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now to the roles of different stakeholders. May I just say we are eager to take your questions. And Sylvia, I forgot to bring my mobile phone up with me to find the questions that come through WhatsApp. Oh, here we go. I'm going to get it delivered into my hand. Thank you so much, Viveka. I appreciate that. So online questions will now flow to me and we'll take audience questions from the room. I actually just want to do a really quick question about liability and the interplay of different actors, and then we'll open it up to questions from the room. So to all of you, we have brought a fantastic panel of stakeholders together. We also have lots more stakeholders in the room, especially when it comes to liability issues. How do we work out the interplay between the different actors in the health area? So normally, if I'm a patient and I go to a doctor, I think the liability rests with the doctor, right? That's just the intuitive sense that a patient in a healthcare system has. How does what we're talking about here affect that distribution of responsibility? And again, I'll go straight down the panel. Alexander?
That's really a difficult situation, especially for the physicians. If patients expect, for example, the AI to be much better than the physician is. So, for example, if you have the image that we saw before, and you ask the physician, you won't get a 100% answer, and you always deal with probabilities. And just to have the physician liable for a decision that cannot properly be made is relatively difficult, and the same is valid for the algorithm. So what I would propose is, for example, if there is some kind of uncertainty, that it's clearly communicated. What we are expecting, just looking at such a picture, is that the algorithm says it's cancer or it's not cancer. And what we are missing is the in-between of the algorithm saying, I can't tell. This is a picture I've never seen before. That's strange. I cannot classify that. And this is something that should also be communicated to the patient. There might be an algorithm that doesn't know what to decide. There might be a physician not knowing what to decide. That's a situation that we frequently have, but you cannot eradicate that just by using AI. And to communicate it to the patient and to say, sorry, I don't know, is probably the most honest way to proceed.
Thank you very much. Jiangbo, how do you handle or approach the liability and black box issues within your country and systems use of AI?
Thank you very much. And as you mentioned, there are different roles in this field, like the regulators, industry, and academia as we are. And as academia, we could explore how far the AI can go and how many possibilities that cutting-edge AI technology could benefit our society, and also how bad it can go. And scientists could also perform experiments and do researches to support the regulators for them to decide how to regulate the AI system and how to make recommendations about specific parameters and specifications. And I think this is the interaction between the academia and the standardization in the field of the sustainable medical AI. And both, as mentioned yesterday, international standards are integral to making the sustainable goals a reality by enabling free and fair international trade and encouraging innovation technology development like AI and medical AI. So I think the fostering trust through the provision of world-class consensus-based specifications is the binding between the academia and the international standardization organizers. And I think And I think the last point is that it is impossible for defining medical AI problems in which that no standard exists in that field. Even when a standard does exist, models of the medical AI can still generate errors or bias within the training data. So I think this is the challenges that we are facing in the medical AI application. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas, what's your perspective on the liability and responsibility issue?
Yeah, I think these issues are not completely new. I mean, we have been using MRIs, for example, in radiology, and who really understands, how that works. And so, in a way, it's an extension, and maybe a step further. But I would say that the liability regimes we have in place now sort of apply. We have, at the international level, we have some regulations. At the national level, the regulators have a key role to play to, approve specific technologies for use with human beings. Then the hospitals make certain decisions, which machines they would use. And in the end, it comes down to the medical professional who also has to make a judgment, and then can be held partially liable in applying whatever technique and in a correct way and so forth. But I think I wanted to come back to the point of Alexander. I think for us, really, the patient needs to be in the center, and the patient needs to be clearly explained and communicated with, what the technology can and cannot do, so that there are no, false expectations and hopes raised. And the informed consent of the patient is really key in the end.
Thank you very much. And Kerstin, you also talked about the need for a patient-centric approach. Nonetheless, briefly looking at this from the point of view of industry, clearly there is concern in the industry about new technologies that perhaps prove to have defects that we couldn't foresee at the moment when they were introduced, and the potential then for liability on the part also of the providers of those technologies. So do you see a risk there? Because of course, as we heard again and again yesterday, AI is a fast-moving, ongoing technology that we do not fully understand, black box. So how do we resolve that in a way that doesn't inhibit the introduction of important medical innovations?
Yeah, so you're raising an important point, and I believe that physicians now really have an important role, because AI currently, also especially from a legal perspective, they assist the physician, but they do not substitute the physician. So the physician is still responsible for the final diagnosis, for the final treatment, and that if physicians then work more closely also with industry, and if there is a better interaction between the players, that can, of course, help to improve these AI systems. And then in a next step, think also about responsibilities that the different stakeholders have, that already my colleagues touched base on. And then we can think about, okay, so should also the manufacturer or the institution that certifies this system, obviously they also carry some responsibility in their area. So I believe that it really needs still a stronger collaboration between physicians and industry, because obviously here currently physicians play a crucial role and currently carry a lot of responsibility.
Thank you very much. And really the same question applies here in regard to standards development and conformity assessment. If a technology is indeed a black box and in the process of ongoing development, to what degree can one reliably certify it and be confident that one has identified all the potential bugs?
I guess as long as it's a black box, you can't So it needs to be opened in a way and needs to be tested in a way that you can evaluate a certain set of these parameters. That's a trivial part of the answer. Now, in terms of the, sorry.
Actually, it's not only trivial. May I just ask you a follow-up to that? Because clearly that requires, and this was something that was touched on yesterday also by Maîtresse, that requires that you're going to have enormous know-how and capacity to look at the algorithms. Is that presently in place in organizations like Maîtresse?
No, not yet. But the job of a Metrology Institute to a certain extent is to provide the basis for proper measurement, not only for today, but also for the future needs that will come. And so obviously National Metrology Institutes, also like Maîtresse, are looking ahead and try to scout the areas and prepare for the areas where new measurement challenges will appear. So that's very, very interesting. Now, the job to evaluate medical products not necessarily resides automatically with the Metrology Institute, but rather with bodies that are specific for that, with notified bodies that that grant market access at some point, with the medical authorities that allow a certain device to come in. What I was wanting to say from the other point of view, and you started with your story at being at the medical doctor and asking him a question on how to treat my problem. Now, the medical doctor himself will not necessarily take a decision based on the one point that the one algorithm tells him that this is your problem, given, I don't know, 90% probability or what it is, but he or she will take into account plenty of other data. I don't know if the numbers are still correct, but maybe 3/4 of all medical decisions are based on some amount of measurement that's being taken, a part is not. And even for simple diseases, dozens or hundreds of parameters are measured, and then the physician integrates over all those. So it's not that from now on, I don't expect that from now on a single algorithm will predict whether or not you're allowed to live or not, or whether treatment 1 or treatment 2 is going to happen. There will always be an integration work that's being done by the physician, and so a certain responsibility lies with the physician, but also maybe a little bit of that responsibility is with us as patients too, because we don't need to think. I mean, it's lovely to think that the medical doctor will know all the answers to all my problems, but maybe he or she doesn't. Maybe he or she gives you one solution, and if you ask him or her again, then there may be 2 or 3 alternatives that are equally promising, and some may be cheaper, and some may be maybe more cost effective, and others may be slightly more convoluted. So we can do something ourselves by asking the doctor back how he or she came to that decision. Yeah.
And the other point that you made is certainly built into some initiatives like the EU's AI package, which talks about human oversight, particularly in areas of more risk in AI. Let me now open the floor to questions, and I think there was one in the first row just now. Please.
Thank you, Thomas Burri from the University of St. Gallen. I have a question to Alexander and Kerstin and Alexander. With regard to the actual practice, when I know it's all research, but I suppose there are a certain amount of experience already. I mean, what we observe in other application domains is that there is a very close interaction between the person who actually uses the AI and the AI itself. So the user adapts to the AI, and in the medical domain, we often hear that there's a risk of de-skilling. But in actual fact, what appears in other domains is that the skills change. The good doctor in the future knows how to interact with the AI, and he or she knows how, what might be wrong or not, or maybe that's a good diagnosis, or maybe it's not so certain. Even if the numbers don't show up, you just get to learn how the algorithm behaves. Do you see any of this occurring in your research? And if yes, what do you do with it?
Well, we are now starting to teach our medical students how to interact with AI. We see great interest in the students, but it's the beginning. All the long-standing physicians, they are not used to it. And especially in the medical field, we are using medical products. So whatever affects the patient's diagnosis or therapy is to be considered as a medical product, and then it needs all the certifications. So we are pretty much reluctant to use things that are not certified. There are now products beginning to get on the market, but these should be medical products. Otherwise, you would not be entitled to use them except in a research context. The interaction with the AI is, of course, a difficult thing. If you think, for example, of learning algorithms, you could also mislearn AI and get it biased. We see that especially if you, for example, have very rare cases, for example, in newborn screening or relatively rare cases in imaging. If you just look at the performance parameters, for example, you want to have 99% accuracy, but you have just one case within 100 patients, then you say all are negative and you have your 99%. That's a mathematical problem. And even if you try to interact with your algorithm and to train it, you have to be aware that you could mistrain it. And then it's also a point of liability. Who's liable for a mistrained algorithm? You trained yourself. It's this company that provides you with that, or is it the researcher that focused on a very specific use case?
Yeah.
And to add on that, so what we can see in medicine and in the education of medicine is, you already touched base on that, but that currently we are thinking about restructuring the curriculum. Now, medicine is a 6 years course, so it's longer than probably most studies that we can conduct. And so the question is really, what should we exclude from the curriculum in order to introduce knowledge in AI? And also, what should be taught to the students? And that's currently being discussed. So the different universities in Switzerland group together to discuss these issues, and they come from different disciplines, so from law, medicine, technology. So that's one way of how we try to skill the new generation. One issue that we also have for those physicians already practicing is that the idea is that they still need to understand everything without AI. And so adding the layer of AI, for example, in the area of radiology means, again, additional skills that have to be acquired. And that's a true challenge that is currently being discussed because it's an add-on. The idea is that now we may not forget the skills that medical doctors have without AI. So adding AI means more resources, more time, and also some insecurity because we don't yet know how AI will further develop in the near future.
Thank you very much. Do I have other questions in the room? In the back, please. And then I'll come to the middle row there. Go ahead and tell us who you are, please.
Okay, so I'm Katrin Grosse, University of Cagliari, so more on the academia side of things. So I think it was Alexander who talked about uncertainty in machine learning models. And I mean, there are models that can provide sound uncertainty, but these models usually perform worse than other models. So what I would like to ask all of you is, what is actually the practical opinion on that? Would it be fine to sacrifice performance to achieve sound uncertainty measures, even maybe sound interpretability? Or is it not an option for you?
Who would like to speak to that?
Well, I could try to start. It depends always on the situation in which you are in. So if you want, for example, to screen for patients, you prefer to have some false positives, but no false negatives. If you have a confirmation diagnostics, this relationship is changed. So there is not really a general answer to this question. What we see is that if you have algorithms for any case of disturbance of a patient, you soon get into some kind of over alerting of the physicians. They are already burdened with stuff, and if every 5 minutes something pops up and says, look at this, look at that, they will disregard at a certain point any of these alerts. So it's always try something in between that points at the necessary things and leaves out the maybe not so necessary things.
Would anyone else like to speak to that?
Just if I may, just to mention that from a metrological point of view, it always makes sense to know that the measurement that you're taking is associated with a certain degree of uncertainty around it. And that thinking is fairly widely known in the area of physics. It may have gotten a lot better into chemistry, but to have it in the healthcare sector, I think that is something new and something that I find very, very encouraging. And good on you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. I had a question in the middle row. Go ahead, please.
So Tim McGar from BSI, the UK National Standards Body. So it strikes me that there's lots of very specific regulation standards around healthcare, but lots of the challenges you mentioned around bias and liability and black box are common in other sort of leading sectors, so self-driving cars and sort of financial services. So let's get a view as to how much of what you talked about is specific to healthcare and how much will be better dealt with in bodies like ISO/IEC, SE42, and more cross-cutting bodies.
Thank you very much. Kai, do you want to start with that, or?
Well, I think it's very important that the dialogue is being had at all levels. I mean, problems specific to healthcare should at least involve both patients and those who are involved in the healthcare sectors. To what extent you can simply bring over a standard that's being developed in other contexts, that should be talked about, that should be discussed. But if it's a good standard, it should be possible to apply it in the healthcare sector with certain modifications. And so I would encourage having both discussions and the ongoing conversation between the different groups.
Let me also ask Andreas to weigh in on that, because again, it goes back to the discussion we had yesterday. Should we be approaching this in a global cross-sector way initially, or does this, granular use case application-based focus make more sense?
Yeah, I think actually it should go both ways. So we need a top-down approach, and I think I agree with you. We should ideally start with regulation across the board as much as we can. At the same time, I think the use cases, as we have shown one, will teach us important lessons bottom up that have to be taken into account. And I agree with our colleague. There needs to be a lot of discussions between different sectors, because this clearly doesn't only affect the health sector alone or the automobile sector. It's really cross-sectional, and I think much more discussion needs to be had among the different sectors about the possibility of common standards.
Thank you very much. And let me ask Jiangbo also, if you would, to comment on this question about the essentially the level at which we approach some of these risks. And I have a similar question that's come in online, which is this, that it was mentioned that AI systems can be subject to new types of cybersecurity threats, for example, data poisoning. And there's talk about regulatory measures to make AI systems more robust against such attacks. And then the questioner asks, are the standard setting organizations the right place to be working on robustness? Is that a promising approach?
Thank you very much. This is a nice question. And I think in the ISO/IEC GTC1, there are many ongoing standardization projects, like those projects I'm just being mentioned in the checkbox. There are some AI standards about robustness, about trustworthy, and also about other scenarios like the financial scenarios and and of course in our medical scenarios. So I think the first one is we should have some top-down strategy to have some AI standards on the general technical issues about this robustness, reliability, and trustworthiness. And also we have to focus on the medical AI application scenarios about just some audience just mentioned that not all the AI algorithms are not a transparency like those traditional AI algorithms like the support vector machine and also like the clustering algorithms. They are not a black box, but in recent decades, the deep learning and deep neural networks indeed is putting some transparency issue on the desktop. So I think this some specific programs that we should focus or address those issues in our medical AI scenario. Thank you.
Jiangbo, in your work, if there were a divergence between an international standard and, for example, national legislation, national Chinese legislation, which would be the prevailing rule that you would look at?
Yeah, this is also a nice question. We are always looking to the international levels of the regulations first, because I think the EU and the United States may come first and put the first step onto this issue. And also, as I know, the Chinese regulations and the Chinese laws are almost recepting these basic concepts of these international regulations and those regulations on the EU and United States. But there was also some local law on the AI application that just issues in the last year. But I think that those basic concepts are the same. Yeah, we are on the same page. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question back here, the lady in the third row. Yeah.
A question for Alexander.
Remind us who you are, please.
Yes, Alev Mine from the One Goal Initiative. You mentioned there are data gaps. So the question is, we may assume that it is due to wrong assumptions, right? What can be done to prevent such wrong assumptions from your point of view?
Well, I would not say it's wrong assumptions. It's more like how you are used to record your data. So, for example, if you have a panel of, let's say, lab tests that you perform every day, then you have a complete data set and your predictions might be much more concise than if you just measure every 3 days or every 5 days. And then the question arises, how would you justify to measure every day? You would, from today's perspective, say it's not medically necessary. I just measure every 5 days and I'm on the secure side because in 5 days I do not expect major changes. But if you then use this data in the term of a reuse for developing an algorithm, you might see that you would need for a better prediction these in-between data. And this is always, of course, a problem with the retrospective data, which the data that has not been recorded cannot be used. So you try to record everything, but on the other hand, it's a burden for the patient and for the patient's insurance to measure stuff every day just for a potential further use. That's a dilemma. You cannot really avoid that.
Thank you very much. So I had 3 questions in the front row, and I'm going to ask, if possible, concise questions so that we hopefully get to those, and I have a few more online as well. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Melinda. Ray Walsh from Dublin City University.
Sorry, Ray, can you pull your microphone? In fact, in general, for everyone speaking from these mics, They're a little hard to understand unless you really pull them toward you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ray Walsh from Dublin City University. Just want to ask the panel, maybe Kai and Andreas in particular, but because we're talking about trust and ethics and very human related functionalities, I suppose, rather than machine-oriented functionalities. And do you see that there's enough work been done, because the decisions have been made, medical decisions have been made, clinical decisions have been made, and AI has been seen as an assistive technology, and the machine really is binary. It's on off, you know. And you see there's enough work happening in the metrics, the measurement end of things in particular, like for benchmarking and for thresholding, for where the decisions are being made. You know, is there enough work going on from all your perspectives in that area to support the assisted decision making, so that we have a better idea? Because people have a holistic view of what needs to be done from a human perspective, but what's been measured and where are the decisions been made, and is there enough work happening in that space?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks a bunch. Me personally, I don't think there's enough measurement being done. Coming from a metrology institute, that's probably not too surprising. But what I'd like to raise is the point about the ethics that you mentioned. I think that's very important, and it's one thing to imply certain minimum standards to a new medical product that's being used, an algorithm that's being used. But I would really, as a user or as a patient, I would really want to see that the people doing the research conform to ethical standards, or at least lay open what their ethical standards are. So I think the ethical thinking about what is right and where you derive that truth or these truth claims from, I think that's really critical. And if we come at it from the side of a scientist, then the measurement stuff is easier to solve. But I am personally convinced that we should be thinking a lot deeper about what our ethics are, where they come from, and which type of biases or which type of claims we're making from there. So in that sense, we need more people like Andreas, and get in a conversation with each and every one of us as scientists, as measurement people, as medical doctors, as legal people, and talk that through, so we get away from an implicit definition of what trust is to at least specifying what we actually mean by it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Andreas, please.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And if I may add, I think this really requires a bigger discussion in our societies and a consensus by civil society and by everyone, essentially, of where we want to go with clinical medicine in the century. And this is why, in my view, the NGOs have also a very big role to play. So dialogue with civil society is something that we need much more in this space. And I would really encourage, all the different stakeholders to open up and host meetings with civil society and really get a broader societal dialogue going in this area.
So what that also means for me is that we don't get out of the ethical challenges by delegating this to the standards guys, that in the end, ethics is very close to politics. And that means that we have to have these challenging political discussions. Here, please.
Yes, Mark Finlay from the Centre for AI and Data Governance. I was just going to make a devil's advocate position on this, that we're talking today as if we have a lot of time to think about ethics and standards and responsibilities. Certainly in the part of the world that I come from, post-pandemic aging society, very, very limited human health resources, hospital administrators and public health promoters are pushing robotics into healthcare at a breakneck pace, and they're much more interested in the work that we've been looking at, certainly in economics than ethics. I'm a bit worried that perhaps the window is closing because of external pressures that we've seen as a consequence of the pandemic plus. What do we do about that in terms of those pressures coming in from the the economic side, the political side, which really do muzzle the opportunity for sensible reflection when we look at robotics in particular.
We will take a deeper dive on robotics later, but we can address this now because, of course, robots are being applied extensively in the healthcare sector. So I'm going to ask Andreas to perhaps speak to that, and also Jiangbo. Jiangbo, I hope that the question was understandable for you. It essentially goes to the pressures that are being faced in many countries to bring these innovations online, and the idea that we don't necessarily have a lot of time to be sitting around debating the fine points of ethics, and that there will be economic pressures to use this technology. Please, Andreas.
Thank you very much for that question. That really highlights a crucial issue. I cannot agree more. I think this is definitely the topic, the fastest moving topic I've ever worked on. And there is no time to lose. And especially, I think the tech companies have a huge power in this area and are moving at a speed where it's difficult for government agencies and international agencies to follow clearly and regulation. So I don't have a really good solution to offer, just to say that we also need to keep pace with these developments, and all the government and public agencies really need to step up their efforts in this area to not lose track and keep up the regulatory and ethical efforts with the rapidly moving technical developments.
Jiangbo, can I come to you for a response to the same point?
Thank you very much. And I think it's a good question. That I have a interesting fact to share that before COVID-19, those medical AI applications, there are some those applications in the market, but the doctors or the physicians are very cautious about applying those AI technology into the medical practice. And after the COVID-19, I think, especially in 2020, there are indeed some of the applications are used in the in diagnosing the pneumonia and the COVID-19 symptoms. So I think this is actually a pressure on the regulators and the standardization organizers that the industry are coming fast, and the pandemic is a game changer indeed. So there are many new software about medical AI applications involving these days, and I think we have to come quickly to catch up with this trend, and not to avoid these risks and opportunity, but we should look into this actual use of these applications. And I think there are some new issued regulations in China about medical AI devices and medical AI software, but I think it's not enough, because we need those international consensus on this issue, and to push forward about the international standardization and international regulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Roger, thank you very much for waiting patiently over there.
Thank you very much. I would like to come back to the interplay between the transversal or horizontal regulation and sector-specific one. And I mean, everybody says that everybody has to talk to each other. That's good. But now, when you think of the institutions, the actors, who should do what? I mean, would be for standards IEC, the organization dealing with medical issues? That's an open question. For instance, in Switzerland, it's the medical community doing the medical standards. So there would be a mismatch. So I would just, my question, very concrete term, which actors should do what? And then we talk about the interplay. Because if the medical people are doing standards, it will be completely disconnected from IAC works, I guess. So how could we ensure that this is not going to happen? Thanks.
So I think we can go down the panel very quickly, if you would please, and if you can come up with a kind of a framework to answer that question. And it doesn't have to be watertight, but I think throughout the day, we're looking at an evolving discussion on how this interplay could look like in practice. So, Alexander.
We actually don't have it. So we would need some kind of roadmap, who should speak at which level, to have some kind of pipeline bringing AI products from the bench to the patient.
So give us the Alexander Leichtle roadmap.
So, yeah, I would say, for example, Swissmedic should be, of course, involved. Ethics committees on the national level, like Swiss Ethics, likewise. And then I'm not sure, I'm not a regulatory person, but these are, I think these two are, from the medical point of view, the ones that should in any case be involved, maybe even the topic specialities of the FMH, but then it's from the medical point of view, like regulated, and then all the legal comes, but I cannot.
And now let's get Andreas to put the global roof over that. So who can drive this on the multilateral global level? And in what way do they interact with the sector specific and the national?
Yeah, at the international level, we have different UN agencies. For example, the ITU, just next door to us, but also UNESCO, and of course WHO for health, and they are all working and collaborating on different norms and standards in the area of AI in their respective sectors. But I think, again, much more dialogue is needed there. And on the national level, if I might add, I think this really requires an all-of-government approach. Somebody at the center of government needs to coordinate all these efforts, similar to maybe 20 years ago when HIV came in. It was clear that it was no longer just a healthcare issue, but all the ministries need to get involved. And I think the same is true for AI. There needs to be a central point in government to coordinate this.
We're starting to see that in the climate area, aren't we? That cross-cutting approach where all of government hopefully gets involved. Kerstin?
So I believe we have to distinguish, first of all, how granular we are and which areas we are. So if it's about technology, if it's on a granular level, what standards? I believe this is really the responsibility of the physicians, and actually physicians are already working on this, both on a national and international level. So I believe what would make sense now, if I could make the rules, I believe then the higher up we go, so national level, be the policymakers, regulators, and then international level, the less granular it should be in order to find a consent. So the more general principles should be implemented. As you mentioned, for example, UNESCO, they're working on they're mapping the ethical principles, and they're working on those very general principles that can also come into law, but that's on a very, very high level. And so we have now in medicine, very granular level, the medical doctors associations, and what I believe could be fruitful and interesting if we would bring then the stakeholders together. So if we would have representatives from the medical association, we would have representatives from UNESCO or from the WHO. We would have representatives from, for example, the Department for Foreign Affairs or other departments. And important is that each institution knows what its role is. I believe that's one crucial fact. And then if each institution does that, and again, medicine would be the technical aspect, international would be more the ethical aspects, and the national representatives would be more on the regulatory focus to actually understand where are the gaps and what has to be actually regulated on a national level. That would be then bringing then the people together and then harmonize that.
And Kai, join up that, if you would please, with standards bodies and the IEC, because clearly the idea here is that the IEC also, as that multilateral roof organization, could play a role as a platform or a joiner.
True. True. From a point of view, who in Switzerland should be involved in the conversation, I think that's where it started. I think there's Qualab, commission who's, or the Verein, the association who's responsible for quality assurance in lab medicine. So these are certainly people I would see involved in that. People from the metrology institutes I would see involved in that. And there has been for the past 4, 5, how many ever years in the Metrology Institute, a lot of work going on also towards medically relevant analysis, clinical chemistry, genetics, microbiology, these types of questions, also pandemics relevant. You asked for the link or how to put together a working system. I think it will, well, it involves political decisions. I would see, well, from an operational point of view, I would try to make the group smaller in the beginning and then keep it growing. See what happens in the neighboring countries. So maybe bring it to a European level, discuss among people who are facing similar problems, make sure the conversation stays open for interested parties from the outside, grow it from there. I would see, I mean, this is me speaking personally, I would see a great need for the input from organizations such as the IEC from the beginning on, because these are the people who have the experience how to put standards together, also working standards together that are then acceptable on the wider field. I would grow it bottom up, probably bring all the interested parties, the relevant parties together, and make sure you have a system in place which is permissive enough to let other groups who might want to have a say or need to have a say in that whole process, let them come to it. And as you are implementing standards, make sure that you also have a way, in the sense of a post-market surveillance, or however you want to call it. Make sure that you can cull, stuff that is being pressed on you, that you have mechanisms how you can get rid of, overly quick inclusions or overly quickly accepted algorithms or whatever come into play. Make sure you have a system how you can cull that relatively soon too.
And Jiangbo, if I can just go to you for a last word on this point again, how these different stakeholders can work together, of course, also internationally. You've made a call several times in your remarks for international standards and said that you, in fact, do look to those for very important guidance in your work. So a final word from you, please.
Thank you very much. And let me just add more lines about advertising my discipline that called biomedical engineering. And this basically we are translating the medical story from the doctors to the industry, to the engineers. And also we translate the engineering or the technical challenges into those lines that the doctors can understand. So we are always doing the similar thing between these different roles. And of course, now there comes the standardization. Now, so as mentioned in the audience, in the chat box, like IMDRF, which is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. This is very important. This is a very important player in the international standardization and regulation, and in the field of medical devices. And maybe the last line is that my wife is a cardiologist, a physician, so we can talk about these roles and better understanding the mutual roles in the doctors and academia and also the international regulators. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Many, many thanks to all of you for being with us today. It's been a very interesting, multidimensional discussion. Let's give them a warm round of applause, please. And We're going now to a coffee break, and we'll come back at 11 o'clock, please, to take a look at our next use case, which is sensor technology. So see you shortly.